We are ready.
Okay.
Laura, can you have?
Okay, so we will get started then.
Yes, you can start.
Thank you so much.
We are listening to your class.
Okay. Sawadee ka to all our colleagues in Thailand. We are so pleased to be with you tonight. Let me share my slides. And let me show as a slideshow. Don't do that. I don't know why it's not going right to it. Let's go. So welcome to session 1 of our 6-session academic training program. Tonight, we will discuss strategic risk management. This was selected for the first session because so much of what we will talk about over the next 5 sessions is part of risk management. So this session will be the foundation for all the sessions that follow. So let me start by introducing you to the team that will lead today's session. My name is Barbara Gruey. I am a senior principal for international strategy and policy at the Mitre Corporation. I am joined here by Joanna Vazana, a group leader in the International Cyber Capacity Building Group, and Matt Chapman, a lead cybersecurity engineer. Also joining us is Alethea Duhan, an associate director for analysis at the National Risk Management Center at CISA. We're delighted to have all of them here. Let me briefly go over our agenda for today. In a moment, we'll talk about our session objectives. And then we'll begin to talk about the strategic risk management process overview. Then we'll talk about conducting risk assessments, criticality assessments. And then we'll take a short break and we'll talk about creating the risk register and threat assessments, vulnerability assessments, estimating consequences. After that break, we will talk about how to do the overall risk scoring and other steps in the risk management process. At the end, Joanna will present a scenario for us that will test our knowledge that we learned from our sessions tonight. As we've noted in our previous training sessions, having objectives for the session is important. Our objectives for this session are that you would be able to answer the following questions. What are the benefits of a risk management program? What are the different elements in a risk program? What is a risk register? How do you measure or score the elements of risk? What are some of the other activities that support a strategic risk management program? And we'll ask you to keep these objectives in your mind, because at the end of the session, we are going to ask you whether if you think we met them. Now, we want to be able to ask you some questions during these sessions. And so we're going to ask you to use Mentee Meter. And these are the instructions. If you go on by opening on your smartphone or opening a new browser on your computer, if you go to mentee.com and enter the code, you should be able to see the questions and answer them. And I'm going to ask Joanna to help us with these particular questions. The first question that will be there in Mentee Meter is getting to know a little bit about you, our audience. It's very difficult not being able to see you in person, so we kind of like to know a little bit about you now that you know a little bit about us. So we have questions for you on which organizations do you represent. If you could please go to mentee.com and answer those questions, then Joanna will be able to show us on the screen what information you've given us.
Barbara, can you give us again the code?
Yes.
Thank you.
There's the code.
And thanks, Barbara. I'm going to go ahead and present our responses, and the code is in the chat. Okay, so you should start to see some of our responses come in. We'll give everyone just a moment to reply. Again, the link and the code is at the top of the screen there. And the choices include private sector entities, government entities, various sectors. Now, all of our polls for these education sessions are completely anonymous, but they do help us to better tailor the information and better understand where you are coming from. So we appreciate your responses. So we have about half of the audience responding. If you haven't voted, you still have time to do so, but at this point, we have about a third of the audience from the banking and finance sector, about a quarter of the audience from the ICT sector, and then a portion of us are from energy and public utilities, or from government outside of NCSA, a few from transportation sector, a few from public health sector, and then our NCSA hosts, and a few also from the education sector. And that balance between banking and ICT is getting a little closer. So Barbara, we can keep this running, but it looks like our responses have slowed down if you'd like to move on.
Yes, could we move to the next question, please?
There we go. Okay. So in this question, we're just asking for a little bit more information about you. If you could share with us your functional role within your organization. You might be on technical staff. You may be responsible for responding and recovering from cyber incidents. You may be responsible as a network defender or system administrator, possibly in management, possibly a policy maker. You might be specifically responsible for risk management, for analysis, for legal duties. Looks like we have a few media coordinators, public relations in the audience. And if there is anyone out there who's responsible for privacy programs or for budgeting or supply chain acquisitions, contracts, please let us know. Looks like about a third of you are responsible for incident response. We have quite a few policymakers, quite a few in the management league. We have network defenders and some that are not defined here. And that is about where our responses are slowing down, Barbara. It's about the same response we got from the first poll.
Okay, so why don't we go back to the program and people can still answer while we're doing that. But if you'll give the screen back to me, I will bring up So let's start talking about the strategic risk management process by giving an overview. When I want to think about cybersecurity, I think about this kind of conceptual framework, which is like a house. There are many rooms with different functions, but they're all together under a single roof. A good house must have a good foundation, and it must also have pipes connecting all the rooms. And here we would think of our pipes as the information sharing pipes that go from room to room. But you'll see the good foundation includes standards, communication processes, and stakeholder management. We also have in our rooms CSIRT function, incident response plans and resiliency, identity management, privacy, a risk register, threat assessments, vulnerability assessments. We have the Internet of Things. And note that our house has wires that go outside the house. So it's external and partner connectivity, which is information sharing, liaison, and training with the external partners. And so as we go over these 6 sessions overall, you will see how we will talk about many of these individual rooms over these different sessions and how they all work together to make sure that you have strategically manage your risk and you improve your cybersecurity functions. Before we get into the details of the strategic risk management process, I wanted to make sure that we understand some basic fundamentals. One of them is a definition of cyber risk. We want to make sure that all of you are working from the same definition as we go through this process. So a cybersecurity risk is defined as the possibility of physical, financial, or reputational damage due to the failure of ICT systems or cyber physical systems to protect the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of data of the systems or the data contained in them. So that is the definition that we are using when we talk about cyber risks. It is important to understand that cyber risks may be associated with people, processes, or technology. And then when we talk about risk today, we are talking about risk as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. We should also understand the types of cyber risk. They may be intentional or they could be accidental. Intentional attacks may range from online crime, including ransomware, exploitation of Internet of Things vulnerabilities, hacktivism, cyber espionage, advanced persistent threat attacks, terrorism, to disgruntled insiders. But these are ones that someone is intending to cause harm from your cyber systems. But there could also be accidental. There are many times when people just make mistakes because they are insufficiently trained. There might be natural disasters, or there might be mechanical failures. Regardless of whether it's intentional or accidental, either situation can cause significant negative consequences. And because of that, we need to talk about how do you manage both intentional or accidental. So what is a strategic risk management program? It's a comprehensive effort that brings all stakeholders together to identify, prioritize, and manage the types of cyber risk an organization is facing. Effectively managing the risks requires understanding them, how they might appear, and developing countermeasures to mitigate the risk or establish resiliency for when bad things happen. An SRA program, can serve to identify, explain, and help provide oversight for the entire breadth of program, financial, operational, and security risk associated with operating these systems. So let's talk about the strategic risk management process. This is the overview of the entire process. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because this is important to understand the steps. So the first step always is identifying and prioritizing your missions. In other words, what is your organization trying to accomplish? Once you've identified missions, you need to determine criticality. How critical are the functions, processes, people, or systems to the mission? Once we know which are the critical assets, then we can talk about identifying the risk. What can go wrong with the functions, processes, people, or systems? Then we can identify or evaluate the risks that we've identified. What is the threat? What is its likelihood? What are the consequences if the risk comes to appear? Fifth is managing the risk. Should the risk be accepted? Should it be avoided, transferred, or mitigated? And finally, we monitor the risk. How is the risk changed, and how should this be managed? And this process that's important is that it is a circular process. It doesn't end at any given point. You continue to monitor, reassess, re-identify. Things that might have been critical at some point may no longer be critical. Some new systems may become more critical. The risks may change. The threat, the vulnerabilities, and the consequences may change. So this is a process that will be continuing. For a moment, look at the bubbles outside the blue circles, and you'll see how important certain kinds of activities are to supporting the strategic risk management process. So, for example, in determining criticality, there may be testing, there's mapping to missions. You'll notice that a couple of these items show up at several points during the process, including exercises in cyber threat intelligence. Those kinds of activities are going to be important to the process all along the way. And we will talk about each of those further along this session. So I'm going to talk a minute about why to establish a strategic risk management process. But at this point, I'd like to turn to Alethea to give CISA's perspective. CISA, through the National Risk Management Center, works with government and industry to identify, analyze, prioritize, and manage the most significant strategic risks to the nation's critical infrastructure. So, Alethea, can you talk to us a little bit about what are the key motivators or reasons why organizations should have a strategic risk program, and what are some of the barriers or challenges for developing these public-private relationships within the cyber community to ensure effective risk management programs? Alethea, if you're speaking, I think you're muted. Well, while we're waiting for Alethea to come on, we can go to the points about why to establish a strategic risk management process. A holistic risk management picture can be helpful to an organization set priorities across the multitude of demands placed on it. You will always have more things to do than you will have time and resources. And so this can help prioritize what you're going to work on. It's a good way to effectively manage finances and resources, to understand interdependencies among risks, figure out how to do due diligence. I think one of the important things from CISA's perspective is strengthen the cyber stakeholder relationships. And it can also be an essential element for scenario planning, testing, and exercising. Importantly, such a program is a required element of the Cybersecurity Act for the Government of Thailand in Section 13, Section 4. So this is an important process to have, and it will help you manage your resources effectively. At this point, let's talk about or ask you a couple questions. If you could go back to Mentee Meter, and we'll have two questions for you regarding your own organization's risk management program and whether you're familiar with the risk assessment process. So if you can all go to Mentee Meter, and Joanna, if you want to let us know how the answers are coming in, please.
Sure thing, Barbara. Okay. Starting to get some responses. Those should show up here. One moment. Okay. So we've got responses coming in. It looks like about half of the respondents do have a risk management process in place and also conduct cyber risk assessments, about a little more than a third. And that is staying consistent. That's staying consistent as responses are coming in.
So it's good to see how many have a risk management process. Fewer conduct the cyber risk assessment. So hopefully we can, through this training session, help increase that.
So it looks like the majority, almost nearly half, do have that risk management process in place, but those numbers aren't equal for those that conduct cyber risk assessments. So it does look like there's a little bit of a gap in having a process in place, but potentially not conducting a formalized risk management or risk assessment, rather. But for those who, there's really quite a small number who report that there's no process in place, which is very encouraging. But yeah, as these numbers have come in, this has been pretty consistent. So this looks like a good view of the audience as a whole.
Great, thank you so much. So let us go back to through the process and how to score the risks. So conducting risk assessments. The risk assessment process has a number of components with it. Now I'm showing you an overview of the risk assessment process that we've adapted from NIST, which in the US is responsible for developing many cybersecurity standards. You may be familiar with NIST cybersecurity framework, for example. I'm going to focus on the area that's outlined in red. So these are the parts of the assessment process: the criticality analysis, the threat and vulnerability analysis, which may be done at the same time or different times, that then would go to a likelihood and then to an impact analysis and assessment, which would give you an overall risk assessment. So we will go through each of these steps to help you understand how to conduct the risk assessment process. Now, the first step in the risk assessment process is conducting a criticality assessment. I would like to turn it over to Matt now, who will help us understand criticality assessments. Matt, can you talk to us now?
Okay, thank you. Took me a minute to get the unmute going. Swati Krap, it's a privilege to speak with you again this morning. Considering a mission-based approach to our risk assessment process, a fundamental principle is that the list of missions to sustain critical services throughout the nation is quite large. Unfortunately, the resources available to contribute to the cybersecurity of these missions is pretty limited in personnel, financial resources, and time. To help map out and prioritize these missions, we have 4 areas listed here on the slide that we want to consider. First, we want to attempt to build a comprehensive list of these missions. This is more of a brainstorming exercise to construct a comprehensive list that applies across the critical infrastructure sectors. Next, once we've finished identifying and prioritizing our organization's missions, we should focus next to how critical are the specific systems, processes, or people to each of these ranked missions. The dependency for these systems and services is mapped out, and it's common that several critical missions could be dependent on the same service. For example, we know how providing healthcare services and public transportation services, those are both highly dependent on specific communications networks. This highlights the need to create this process to not only rank the missions, but score the criticality of the supporting subsystems. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, this mapping leads to a best practice called crown jewel analysis. Basically, what are your nation's most valuable or critical assets that absolutely must be protected and resourced above all of the other ones? The bottom image here on the slide is a dependency map. I understand it's kind of small, a little bit unreadable, but we don't want to focus on the specifics, but the view of all of those dependencies, all those interconnection of systems that support one or maybe several missions. These maps are a crucial step to help us locate some of those hidden crown jewels to mission success, or maybe some areas where we might find a single point of failure across various infrastructure sectors. In our map here, we're concerned about our cyber assets, and we can think about that. Those might include network media, hardware applications. We have terrestrial, air, and space communications channels, data centers, and let's not forget the operational technology specific to each industry service. This mission-based approach is a strategic risk management. Is just one of the best practices, but there's other approaches to risk management, and we'll go ahead and let's pass this to Alethea with our National Risk Management Center, and she'll talk about another approach besides this mission-focused approach. Alethea?
I understand she's been having challenges unmuting, so I think we are trying to manually unmute her. Are we having any success, Joanna?
It looks like from this view, she is unmuted, but it doesn't seem to be making any difference.
It may be on her computer that doesn't have her speaker up. Well, she's working on that. Maybe Matt, if you want to talk, can you talk a little bit about these other ways to identify these critical assets? Or do you want me to talk about it?
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
So we've talked about our crown jewel assessment and how do we prioritize some of our critical resources, right? These people, the money, and all of our resources that are going to do assessments by mission. Another way to really approach this is looking at the nation's critical functions. There's several categories, right? 7 or 8 critical infrastructure sectors. In the United States, it's 16, and they provide essential services to the population, right? This is wastewater and water treatment, agriculture, the chemical industry, transportation, health services. If we consider these critical functions, we can break them up in each of their components, and rather than going at from a mission perspective, we can look at those critical functions that really are the backbone of your critical infrastructure that make your nation operate. Let's go to the next slide, and we have a pretty interesting breakdown of this. It may be a little bit difficult to read, but you see there's some categories that these are our responsibilities to our population and to our citizens to provide. They're broken into these categories. You can think of connecting, which is a lot of networking. I mentioned you have the terrestrial networking, the wireless networking, and of course the space communication systems and transoceanic cables, right, when we're working with other nation states and other countries. Within that connect section, these are the critical functions that critical infrastructure sectors are responsible for to provide those services. I'll just pick a couple of those. We have to operate our core networks, right? That one we kind of understand as the basic function of connectivity. But there's some highlights that talk about all of those different modalities, which are Wi-Fi, broadband, and of course we want some redundancy in those if the case there's a surge. Then once we have that, we have to distribute our critical services across our population, whether we're generating electricity or we have vaccinations for a global pandemic. What are all the processes and functions to distribute that? And here's a nice list of those core functions. Moving on to the manage it, right, there's certain things we have to manage. We have to manage our economy. I see we have a lot of folks from the financial sector, right? We have to make sure the economic situation is stable. We have to make sure we manage all of those critical resources that our water at times may be very constrained, food, and particularly now with our global pandemic, we have to worry about medicine distribution. So the management task is something that the government must maintain. Finally, there's the supply, and this goes all the way from just basic survival, which is our air quality, the water supply, and the food supply, to our medical and health, to what are the services we expect, as a well-functioning country, which is our electricity, our chemical plants, and even the defense of the country. So looking at these as a second approach, rather than looking at the missions, look at the core critical functions, and what do we have to provide? And then, of course, at some point, we have to rank them, which leads into my next slide, please. Now we're going to measure this. Whether you approach risk management with a mission-based approach, as I talked about with the crown jewel assessment, or a national critical functions approach, there has to be some way to measure and categorize our assets. Again, whether they're the crown jewels, priority systems, or if they're low priority, they're going to be low priority for resourcing, because we know there's not enough people, there's not enough resources, and frankly, there's not enough time to protect everything, because this is a rapidly evolving cyber situation with all of our cyber threat actors we have to be concerned about. In our chart, the tiers illustrated here are an example of this kind of prioritization. So criteria, like the descriptions in the table, will help leaders determine where resources will be allocated based on that crown jewel or mission assessment, and also based on that critical functions assessment, if we want to take that approach. And we could take a hybrid approach to do those as well. So for example, let's take a look at the top tier there in red. That's listed as critical. A failure in a critical system, of course, this is a sample definition, would result in total mission failure. Obviously, that's the worst case scenario. As an example, let's consider water and wastewater. We mentioned that a couple of times. If we had a mission to provide clean drinking water to Bangkok, to Chiang Mai, to some high-density population area, and the single water purification system failed, that would result in a total mission failure. If there weren't redundant mission systems, for water purification, and this was listed as critical, we can go over and we see that the final column on our chart says that a cyber risk assessment of that system and those components must be conducted. See, this determines that the city's water purification system is resourced for a detailed risk assessment. And I saw there's a lot of folks on incident response teams that are in here. You understand the amount of resources it takes to do some of those detailed vulnerability assessments that we're going to talk about later, whether they're assessments or full-scale security audits. So when we have something in that tier 1 and really that tier 2 high level, we're responsible to make sure that resources are allocated against that. That's why it's so important to have this tier system. We can see in the table that the severity decreases with each of the rows, and consequently, so would the resourcing. It's difficult to impossible to resource all of the critical systems, so the very difficult decision has to be made through these processes of a crown jewel analysis or a national functions analysis to decide where it's going to go. And as Barbara said, this has something to do with threat, has something to do with the ability of the threat actor to do it, and how many vulnerabilities that they'll be able to take advantage of or exploit. We're going to move to our first break here. We're nearing the top of the hour. So I'll go ahead and pass it back to Barbara. If you want to
Barbara,
finish this.
before you do, can you hear me? This is Quinn from CISA.
Yes, I can
Yay!
hear you. So,
I don't know what's going on. Both Alethea and myself are experiencing some tech issues. I have joined via the browser. We have tried dialing in and we've tried using the Microsoft app. So if you could please pardon the technical difficulties, we're going to try to get Alethea on here in a second. Thank you so much for your patience.
okay, I think we're going to go into a short break now, and perhaps we can have Alethea work on trying to get on, and I'll keep it open so that if she can get on and speak, then we'll definitely go right to her once we can have her speak. But thanks for letting us know, Quinn.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So we are going to take a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we will start talking about the risk register where you can catalog and track your known risks. So it is now approximately 9:56 a.m., I believe, in Bangkok.